Okay, we're going to take a look at some more material editing functions now that maybe we didn't go as far as in depth as we should have, or just some other features that maybe we didn't cover. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is just going to load a sphere as kind of our base operation here. Our simple material we're going to be editing just on a basic object. We're going to just go ahead and drop that. And the first thing we're actually going to take a look at is reflection maps. And now if you don't want to reflect everything in the scene, because maybe it's taking a while to reflect everything, you only have maybe one standard object, and if you already have maybe pre-rendered sky, or you went ahead and rendered the sky, but you don't want to take the time to render the reflections, well, I'll show you where to load that in. We're going to go to Edit Material, and go to Reflections, and as you can see down here, we have a use reflection map, but it's not active right now, but that's because we don't have any reflection. If we bring that up to 100%, we can use a reflection map, and we can also use a variable reflectivity, which means we can use the function editor to add some nodes in there and really vary that if we want to. Or we can use a reflection map. And if we go ahead and click load, it'll load in any of the images that are already in here, or any of the ones that maybe you've created yourself and loaded in with collections. We're going to use one of these HDRI skies, or just one of these backgrounds, and click OK. And now what we have is our object is reflecting an image. And if you take a look at the scene, you'll see that it's not reflecting the sky at all, it's just reflecting that image, which can lead to a lot faster render times, depending. So if you just have one stationary object and you really don't want it to reflect certain aspects of the background, or if you maybe just have a black sky and you're doing just one object, but you want to have something nice to make it appear reflective, you can use this method to make some really neat stuff. And you can vary that reflection of that image map just by lowering the reflectivity. Or you could actually create a function out of it, and we can vary it that way using nodes in the function editor. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom this in here so we can see it just a little bit better. And we're going to click on that little lightning bolt to make it as a function, so we edit it with a function. And by default, it's set to a constant value, which means we're editing this as just a constant, just like we were before. It was just a constant value, except it wasn't in the function editor. So what we can do is have this constant selected and replace that with a fractal. So now we have a fractal node, and we can of course edit that to vary our reflection. So let's say we only wanted spots of this object to be reflective, and the rest of it to not be reflective at all. Well, we can go ahead and adjust this. I'm going to bring some roughness, some gain. I'm going to make a real powerful effect, just so that we can really see what's going on here. Real dark and high contrast. And go ahead and click OK. And now if we render this, we can see we still have our original surface in there underneath, but some parts are reflective. And this doesn't just work for reflection maps either. If we turn off our reflection map and take a look at reflecting our sky, we can see it reflecting the sky 100% in the white areas and none at all in the black areas, so 0%. So it's a pretty neat effect if you want to create some custom reflections on there. It's really good for making buildings if you use the correct textures, or even use image maps for this even. So if we go into, click that lightning bolt again, and go back into our function editor, if you want, we could also replace that with a texture map. And then what we can do is, right now it's set to image sequence animation map. If we set it to just a texture map, we can actually load in a grayscale image. And I can use any one of these that I already have in there. And I'll just use this terrain one. And I'm going to set our UV coordinates, and we can either leave that on automatic, or we could use spherical, since we are using a sphere, and click OK. And now we have that map actually generating our reflection. So if you're making a building, you could make custom maps to have just the windows be reflective, or those certain parts, and really create all your texture maps and make an entire box become a building. There's a lot you can do with that. And if you notice right here, we're using spherical mapping. And if you take a look at the top and see what that's doing, we can see the way that it's kind of combining up at top. And you can see that we do have a seam in there. And that's because this is not a tileable texture. You want to make sure that you're using seamless textures when you're doing maps, or make sure that they're generated specifically for spherical mapping if you're going to map it onto a sphere. What we could actually do in this case, uh, let's see, take a look here. We're going to go back into the function editor, and actually we just cleared that out by hitting the little lightning bolt. We're going to change that back to our texture map, and just load that back in there. Take a look at our UV coordinates. Now we could set it to flat vertical if we wanted. And now render that. And you can see now we have this stretching. Because what it's actually doing is projecting our image to the top. But because we have so much space, pretty much this area from here to here, where it's projecting only a few pixels for such a large amount of area, we get this stretching effect. So you want to make sure you're using the correct mapping features, and these features are also up here. And that's for your overall texture maps that you're using, and not so much the function editor. What we also have is a cylindrical map that we can use, and I'll show you that. Go back to our function editor, and we'll change that just to our cylindrical map. And now if we take a look, we have a little more stretching around the edges. And now we could edit our numbers so that it's repeating itself more often around that sphere. But we're still going to have that problem with this seam because we're using a custom map, and this custom map is not meant for a sphere because it's not a spherical map. It wasn't created to be placed onto a sphere. It was more of a terrain map or something for a flat object. So you are going to run into a problem like this. And a cylindrical map and a spherical map are pretty similar, except a spherical map will evaluate things a little bit differently, and it's more an all-around projection and not so much just on the sides. A cylindrical map will mostly just cover the sides because it is pretty much for a cylinder type mapping. We could also use the automatic, and if we click on that, we can see the effect that that has. And that automatic is pretty much set it to a sphere because it's detected that it's on a sphere, so it's going to use a spherical map. So sometimes the automatic settings won't work, and sometimes they will, to your advantage, I guess. And it's really just got to play around with it and see what works best for what model you're using, depending on the shape. And if you're using UVs, actual UV maps, then it's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to go ahead and close that out. And now we still have that kind of stretched effect, but we can go ahead and delete that. And now we're no longer using a function at all to control our reflectiveness. And what we could also do is go ahead and blur that reflection if we wanted to, which will add a little bit more to it. And those do work all together. You don't need to worry about canceling anything out. You could have those function editor going for the reflectivity, for the globalness, but if you add the blurred reflections, it will still work with it. So don't think that you're canceling anything out by using these extra features, because they can add a whole lot to the scene. If you take a look at variable reflectivity too, we have the ability to control our reflection on a filter, so we can actually edit a filter for this, and go in and add points, and give it a little bit of a change right there, and click OK. And now we notice is being controlled by that filter, so we have a lot more variation in there. We could also adjust the blurring with this method. So if we add another point in there and turn the curves on, go ahead and change that, click OK. Now we're adjusting the blur, so we're going to notice a little bit of blur in some of the areas where we didn't before. And we can also have a function for this reflection. And so if we take a look at reflection right here, we can go ahead and add in either texture map node or a fractal node we're going to use right now. And just up our gain or roughness, because I just want to make a dramatic effect once again, so we can really see that. I'm using just the same settings, just to kind of show you. But that doesn't mean you have to use these settings, of course. You can use any that you want at all, any type of node. There's tons of different options you have. But as you can see, now we have just our little bits and areas showing up there based on that node. And this also works for many other different things. We could do this for transparency as well. We can adjust our global transparency and even our blurred transparency and things like that with nodes. And as we see, we have our constant for our global transparency. We could switch that out for a fractal. Up our gain, our roughness, scale it down. just so something dramatic. And now we can see there's going to cut some holes in there. And you're noticing it's turning very white, and that's because it's reflecting the insides as well, and all over the place, so it's doing a little bit extra. If we take a look at our shadow, you can see we've actually gone ahead and cut holes in that. So this is kind of a neat way if you want to do some nice little variable reflections, where you can use the nodes available in the function editor. And of course, you don't have to use these Perlin noises. You can use just about anything that you want that's available in here. We could do math patterns, square patterns, other patterns. We could use water if we wanted to, and put a water effect on there. And now we'll notice an entirely different type of texture as far as the transparency goes. And if we go ahead and check off the reflective, and now we can see that. And this is probably a little bit better of a preview where you can see the nice stretching on there. And we can just adjust all of these little features, and there we go. We can see that a little bit better now. We just have this nice little effect in there, so you can get some really neat textures by doing this, and some really neat effects. And we have a little bit of blurring in there, but we can go ahead and adjust our gain and the overall contrast on it if we wanted, and get some really sharp edges, or we just use a different node. Like I said, it works with any of the nodes, and you're not really confined by them at all, and you could even use it as custom maps if you wanted to create a custom effect. So if you wanted to have little holes in there and there was no node for that, you could just make a texture map with a hole cut out, so black on the outside and then white on the outside and then a black dot, or vice versa. You could even invert that, probably work better the other way, and then you can get a little hole kind of punched in there if you wanted to. So there's just neat little things you can do. You can do that to build archways, although it's not entirely as realistic. You can do it with image maps and clip maps to kind of give you cutouts. But now that you know a lot more about the function editor, you can really go in and start playing around with all these features and just seeing what everything does and how it affects your specific material looking at, and learn as much as you want about what's going on. It also gives you a better idea too if you start reverse engineering some of the textures that are already there and some of the stuff in the material editor, material chooser. If we go ahead and click that arrow, you take a look at any of these textures, and now they kind of have an idea of how they're put together. It gives you a real better understanding by knowing the function editor and knowing how these textures work, and now you can really take a look and see how they were made and learn from that, which is probably one of the best methods you could do, is just learn from what other people are doing, because the tutorials can only go so far, but when you go in and take a bunch of extra time, you could spend hours going through and just dissecting one material and just taking a look and seeing how it was made, although a lot of the time that material wasn't made as extremely precise, so don't stick too much to that. You don't want to end up using those as your defaults for creating all your materials, which can be a problem sometimes that people have, is they'll learn one specific texture and they'll use it for everything, and then everything looks really bland. So you want to go through, add some variations, change it up a bit, and don't be confined by what other people are using. Make additions to it and really make it your own. Okay, and there's one last effect I want to show you now. And we're going to go to File, New, and I'm just going to load a new scene. No, just pretty much our default scene, and I'm going to show you caustics. If you haven't used caustics before, that's a really neat lighting technology. And we're going to go in and just create a sphere. And just basic scene will show you this. It doesn't have to be anything super complex. All this works with pretty much every material. What we're going to do is go in and edit material, and under transparency, I want to add some transparency in there to make it more of a glass. As you can see, we have nothing now, but we're going to add some effects in here, and maybe we'll up the diffusion level a little, and we'll take a look at, add a little bit of reflection. We just want to kind of create a glass texture. And we're going to up our refraction index to, let's go up to 1.5, which is glass. I'm just going to have to type that in. And then we'll go ahead and give it some highlights. Just kind of give it a nice little glass texture. But now what we want to do is check Show Caustics. And actually, I'm going to uncheck that right now just to show you what we have with our preview. Before I turn that on, we have a very bright looking surface. We could actually probably lower the diffusion or maybe the reflection that we have on it so it's not so bright. Maybe we'll go into reflections and turn it down just a little and see our preview, and that looks a lot better. And with that refraction on there, we get the glass texture, the glass look where we're refracting all of our light and everything inside of it. And if you have a refraction index, actually just go online and you can find one. Some reference manuals actually have the chart for some of the refraction indexes, but this is all based on realistic refraction. 1.33 being water, 1.5 being glass, and there's a whole section of these for tons of different materials. So even if you're looking for something like beer or wine or anything, even diamonds and crystals, they all have specific refraction indexes. So you want to type in their specific number because this is really based on a realistic refraction index, where 1.5 is actually what they use scientifically for an actual refraction index. So you want to use those correctly. It'll give you a much better looking effect. But if we take a look at our preview now, you see it's pretty interesting. But normally we have this nice little effect with glass where we have, when light shines through it, we get a cool, bright little effect, and that's caustics. So if we turn on caustics and take a look now, you'll see we get that effect where we have a nice shadow and then a bright little light in there. I'm going to click OK. We're going to zoom in here. And caustics is really neat because you want to turn that on for any of your glass items and things like that, because you can get some really fantastic effects. Caustics also appears with metal objects in real life, but we're not able to actually create that in view, but we can do it with all the glass objects. If you want to take wine glasses or anything like that, or just regular mugs or any glasses at all, you can just create this really neat effect by using caustics. So it's a quick render. So don't worry about it really eating up a lot of time. I mean, of course, the more geometry you have, the longer it might take, but you can get a really neat effect just with the default settings. And there's really not much you can do with it as far as the changes in the caustics, but that's pretty neat and pretty realistic.